Looking back at historic events, there are many strange and inexplicable occurrences that have not been solved, some of which include the most unlikely of coincidences that almost seem too outlandish to be true. But if history has taught us anything, it's to expect the unexpected, no matter how unlikely it may seem. Number 10. In 1853, 39-year-old Wilmer McLean, a wholesale grocer who lived in Alexandria, Virginia, fell in love with the mother of two called Virginia Mason. She'd been married before, but her husband had passed away, and shortly after meeting, she and Wilmer decided to get married. Virginia was a rich woman who owned a plantation named Yorkshire that was located at Menace Junction, close to the Bull Run River. After they were married, Wilmer moved in with Virginia and her two children at the plantation, where they lived peacefully for the next 8 years. Wilmer had served in the military when he was younger, fighting in the Mexican War, during which he attained the rank of major. He'd also served as a major in the Virginia militia. The American Civil War was poised to break out that year, but Wilmer was too old to be conscripted. But little did he know that he would still have a role to play in the conflict. The first official battle of the war took place at Fort Sumter, which is situated close to Charleston, South Carolina. The fight lasted for a total of 36 hours, after which the Union surrendered to the Confederates, marking the true start of the Civil War. The skirmish had been all but inevitable for the previous 3 months, while both sides readied themselves for battle. At the time, most people believed that the conflict would be resolved after a single fight, never imagining that it would actually take 4 years. Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard needed a headquarters from where he could direct his troops, and after calculating that the battle would likely take place in the Manassas area, he commandeered the McLean family's plantation. The family was forced to look for a new place to live, but they were well compensated for the inconvenience. In the meantime, Beauregard had settled down in his new headquarters, and one night while he was having dinner, a Union cannonball struck the kitchen, and the first full-scale fray of the war had begun. The battle would once again end with the Confederate victory, and once the fight, which was reported as being particularly brutal, was over, the family's house was converted into a hospital where wounded soldiers could receive treatment. The family would move back into the badly damaged house 6 months after they were forced to leave, but it wouldn't be long before their house was once again caught in the middle of the war. A year after the first battle had taken place, another skirmish broke out at Manassas. The battle was named Bull Run by the Union and Manassas by the Confederates, and once again the fight was a particularly vicious one. Fearing for the safety of his family, Wilmer decided to relocate once again, and this time he put the plantation up for sale and moved to the town of Appomattox Courthouse, also in Virginia, but 100 miles to the southwest. McLean believed that he'd finally left the conflict behind him, and he concentrated his energy on taking care of his family and his role as a sugar purveyor for the Confederate Army. But he would once again become part of the war in 1965, when Robert E. Lee marched from Petersburg after realizing that his men were badly outnumbered and running out of vital supplies. He and his men traveled to North Carolina, where they met up with General Joseph E. Johnston and his men. But General Ulysses S. Grant and his Union troops were in hot pursuit. They would eventually catch up with the Confederate side at Sailor's Creek, a clearing close to the McLean's new house. Realizing that there was very little hope for a victory, Lee decided to meet with Grant, and he sent Colonel Charles Marshall to acquire a suitable place for his surrender to take place. And he asked the first person that he came across in Appomattox Courthouse if they knew a fitting location. This person just happened to be Wilmer McLean, who was reluctant to offer up his own house, but upon realizing that the meeting would end in surrender, he assumed that his house would be left undamaged, and so offered for the meeting to take place in his front parlor. Lee accepted the offer, and so the historic meeting took place, during which the two generals agreed upon the terms of the Confederate surrender. But once all was said and done, Union soldiers realized that they were present at an important historic event and started collecting souvenirs from the house. They tore up the furniture, took chairs and tables, cut down fencing around the house, helped themselves to inkwells, and even made off with his daughter's doll. While this was happening, they left money and gold coins as compensation. But the family was still shocked at their appalling behavior, though they could do little to stop it. And so McLean's first house saw the start of the American Civil War, while his second became the site of its long-awaited conclusion, and a coincidence that would be hard to believe if it wasn't extensively documented. Number 9. Most of us are familiar with the famous Dennis the Menace comic strip, created by Hank Ketchum, that features a young boy with blonde hair who's always getting into trouble, especially with his next-door neighbor, the elderly Mr. Wilson. But not many people living outside the UK are aware that he has a counterpart, also called Dennis the Menace, that was created by David Law. That version is also extremely popular there, but there are some definite differences between the two characters. The first and most obvious difference between the two is their physical appearance. The US Dennis, Dennis Mitchell, has blonde hair and freckles. He usually wears a red bib overall with a blue and black shirt underneath. He also has a white dog named Ruff, and his parents are Henry and Alice. As for the UK Dennis, he was first introduced to the world wearing a suit and a striped tie, but soon after, his outfit was changed to the red and white striped jumper and black shorts that he's now well known for. This Dennis also has a dog, but it's a black, wire-haired tripe hound named Nasher. His parents are called Dennis and Sandra. He can usually be seen carrying a catapult in his back pocket. He also has jet black hair, just like the UK version, and spends a lot of time riding on his skateboard. The US Dennis is portrayed as a well-mannered boy whose antics are often amusing, even to those who are on the wrong side of his misdeeds. Some would describe him as more irritating than naughty, and usually apologizes for any mischief that he gets up to. The UK version is again much different when it comes to personality. His mischief is usually far more intense, often destructive, and usually a result of either boredom or an outright desire to cause as much damage as possible. While Dennis Mitchell seems to try and learn from his mistakes, the UK version is usually proud of his behavior and seems to care little for those who have the misfortune of being on the wrong side of his nefarious plans. The two characters couldn't be more dissimilar, and one might think that this was done intentionally since they have the same name, and hence it would be seen as an outright plagiarism if they were too alike. But these changes weren't intentional at all. Despite their many distinctions, there's one similarity between the two comics that was completely unplanned, and borders on the absurd as far as coincidences go. Ketchum and Law were completely unaware, not only of each other, but also of their respective creations. But quite unbelievably, both comic strips debuted on the same day, the 12th of March 1951. The UK version made its first appearance in the 452nd edition of the long-running, immensely popular comic The Beano, which first appeared back in 1938 and is still running today, remaining as popular as ever. As for Dennis Mitchell, he made his debut in a comic strip that was published by several different newspapers that were being distributed by the Post Hall Syndicate, which was sold in 1967. When the two characters became household names, people assumed that either Law or Ketchum had stolen the idea from the other, since it was virtually unthinkable that two cartoon characters with the exact same name would be introduced to the world on the same day. But it would soon come to light that this simply wasn't the case. The two cartoonists soon learned of each other's creations and agreed to let each other carry on publishing their work, since it became obvious that both characters were born out of the catchy titles that they'd been given. The US version of Dennis the Menace would go on to become a popular comic the world over, with a successful animated series and live-action movies, eventually being made with Dennis as the star, while his UK counterpart remained mostly popular on that continent, and the comic's title was eventually changed to Dennis the Nasher. It's a coincidence that seems almost too far-fetched to believe, but the simple fact is that each of these characters was created from an original idea that just happened to occur to two different creators at the same time. Number 8. When someone goes missing, their loved ones are often left with a lot of questions that in some cases go unanswered for years or even decades after the fact. And when law enforcement is unable to track them down, it's usually up to their family members to continue the investigation on their own. This rarely leads to the case being solved, but in some instances, their hard work and perseverance does pay off, usually through handing out flyers and creating awareness about the disappearance. But some missing person cases are more bizarre than others, as they include some strange coincidences. One example is when 72-year-old Robert McDonough went missing from Leamington in Maine. Robert's family was worried about him since he suffered from dementia, and by the time a news crew arrived to report on his story, he'd been missing for 14 hours. A helicopter crew had been scouring the area around Robert's house for any sign of him, but up to this point had been unable to track him down. As the news crew was setting up to cover the story at around 7 a.m., an elderly man walked up behind reporter Norm Karkos, and as he passed by, the two greeted each other and thought nothing more of it. But when the man then started walking towards Robert's house, Karkos suddenly caught on to the fact that the elderly man was Robert, and that he'd somehow found his own way home, completely unaware that he was the focus of a missing person investigation. Karkos noted that Robert seemed to be in good spirits and good health, save for a small amount of biological material that was present on one of his hands, though it was never revealed how he came by this small injury. Robert had been reunited with his loved ones in the most unlikely of fashions. But there's another missing person case that's just as bizarre, if not more so, and it involves a 21-year-old woman named Lisa Dick. In 2010, Lisa's father, Michael, had been separated from his first wife, Lisa's mother, for more than 10 years, and he'd not seen or heard from his daughter since. Not only had he had no contact with her, but he had no idea where she was, something that bothered him immensely. The only clue that he had was that she had moved to Sudbury in Suffolk, England at some point, but had no clue which area of town she was living in, who she was living with, if she still lived there, or if she was in good health. And so he decided to launch his own search effort with the help of his other two daughters, Shannon and Samantha. The search for Lisa was far from successful, since Michael had virtually no information to go on, and he couldn't even be sure what she looked like after all those years. He had no choice but to stop the search and look for new avenues to explore. He then contacted a local newspaper called the Suffolk Free Press and asked them to cover his story, which they were happy to do. Michael and his two daughters accompanied one of the newspaper's photographers to an area in town where he took a photo of the family, promising them that it would be published in the next edition. Michael was hopeful that Lisa, or someone she knew, would see the article and get in touch, but he was in for a surprise after the photo was released. Lisa did see the photo in the newspaper a few days later, but she also noticed something far more uncanny in the snapshot. She realized that she and her mother had been in the same area where the photo was taken a few days earlier, and quite unbelievably, she spotted herself and her mother in the background of the photo. Not only that, but she also revealed that she and her mother had been standing in the exact spot where Michael and his daughters were photographed about a minute before the picture was taken, and had walked away merely moments before Michael and the reporter arrived. She added that she'd been talking to a friend of hers a few days earlier, and stated that she was thinking about finding her father since she hadn't seen him for so long. When she showed her father what she had discovered in the background of the photo, he thought she was playing a prank on him at first, but soon realized that the uncanny coincidence was in fact true. Michael has since reunited with Lisa and has met his 3 grandchildren whom he'd never seen before. Number 7. Anthony Hopkins has been hailed as one of the greatest actors of his generation, and is best remembered by many people for his role in the massively successful horror movie called The Silence of the Lambs. But Hopkins' career wasn't always as sturdy and flourishing as it is today. In 1972, he was unhappy with the state of his career, since he'd been cast in several spy movies and he was worried that he was becoming a typecast actor. He decided that he wanted to look for a different type of role that could help him broaden his horizons away from the action-packed movies that he'd been a part of in recent times, and he was determined to do so. Luckily, he didn't have to wait long, as he received an offer to audition for a role in a comedy film called The Girl from Petrova. If he were to land the role, he would star in the movie alongside 2 very well-known actors, and so he decided to follow through on the offer. Following his audition, he was informed that he had landed the role, but it would be a further 2 years before production started. But Hopkins was excited to start a new chapter in his well-established career. The film was based on a novel written by George Pfeiffer, and revolves around an American journalist, played by Hal Holbrook, who travels to the Soviet Union, where she meets a ballerina, played by Goldie Hawn, and before long he falls in love with her. Unbeknownst to him, the ballerina is being watched by the police, since she's living in the country illegally, and he soon finds himself in the midst of a KGB investigation, as the authorities do everything in their power to stop the romance from going any further. When the time for production on the movie drew closer in 1974, Hopkins traveled to London to prepare himself for the role, which included reading the novel so that he would be familiar with the character that he would be playing, which was that of a Russian informal trader named Kostya. He traveled to Charing Cross Road in London and stopped in at a bookstore to pick up a copy of the book, but was told that the book had not yet been released in the UK, and they would have to have one shipped over from the US. Hopkins started to worry that he wouldn't be able to have a copy shipped in time before filming started, but there were no other options, and so he headed to Leicester Square Station to catch a train back to his accommodation. While sitting on a bench in the train station, he started thinking about how he would go about having a copy of the book sent over from the States, when he noticed something on a bench a short distance away. He realized that someone had left a novel behind, and so he walked over to see what it was, and to his great astonishment, it was a copy of The Girl from Petrova. He couldn't believe his luck, but was elated to have had such good fortune. But he noticed that this wasn't just a normal copy of the book, since it included editorial notes, likely for the upcoming UK release, and he realized that he was probably one of the first people to see this particular version. He read the entire novel in one sitting, and felt ready for his role when he traveled to Vienna the next year to start filming. But the strange events in this story weren't over yet, as there was one more unbelievable coincidence to be revealed. While on set, he met with the novel's author, who had traveled to the set since he was in the midst of writing an article about what it felt like to see his novel being transformed into a major feature film. Pfeiffer wasn't comfortable on set as he found it to be very busy, and so he stayed quietly in the background where he felt most comfortable. And on one occasion, he ran into Hopkins, and the two started talking. Hopkins told Pfeiffer of the difficulties he had in trying to find a copy of the book in London, to which Pfeiffer responded that it was mostly his fault, since he'd been responsible for the delay of the book being released in the UK. He added that when he was in London, he had a copy of the book that he was using to edit the movie's manuscript, but he'd lent it to one of his friends against his better judgment. His friend left with the book and carelessly left it in the back seat of his car, which was then stolen a short time later from Hyde Park Square, and the book was still inside. Hopkins realized what was going on and without a word ran to his dressing room to grab the copy that he'd found at Leicester Square Station. Upon his return, he quipped, "Might this copy have some personal meaning to you?" Pfeiffer was dumbstruck to find that this was indeed the very same copy of the book that he'd been working on before it was lost, and stated that he'd never seen anything so bizarre in his life. The film wouldn't be a massive success, and Hopkins has since stated that it was one of his least favorite roles that he's ever played, but it cemented his career as a Hollywood actor, and he would see great success in the decades that followed. Number 6. Most of us have heard stories of twins that have been tragically separated at birth, either due to their parents being unable to care for them properly, being put up for adoption, or because of other unavoidable factors. Sometimes these twins are never able to reach each other again, usually because adoption documents are subject to strict confidentiality clauses. But in some instances, they're able to track each other down and eventually get to know each other decades after they were born. But one particular story involving a set of twins that were separated after being born has left many people in disbelief, as it contains so many coincidences that it almost seems to have been made up. The twins in question were two brothers who were born in an Ohio hospital in 1940. After being born, the two boys spent 3 weeks in the hospital before eventually being separated. One of the boys was adopted by the Springer family and was taken back to their home in Piqua, Ohio, while the other was adopted by the Lewis family, who hailed from Lima, also in Ohio. Many years later, it would come to light that both sets of parents had called their new sons Jim, but as unlikely as that may seem, it's far from unheard of. But this is just one of a series of unbelievable coincidences that would be revealed many years later. As an adult, one of the Jims decided that he would like to get to know his long-lost brother, but he had no idea where to start looking for him. he decided to employ the services of a dedicated research team, and before long, he received word that his brother had been tracked down. He was also told that the team had made contact with his brother, and that he was also very interested in meeting his twin, who he'd never seen before. A meeting was scheduled, and both Jims were excited at the prospect of meeting a new family member. The meeting was a highly publicized affair, as it took place on the then popular Phil Donahue show. The twins were now 39 years old and had dreamed of this day for decades, which they now got to share with millions of people across the world. They were astonished to learn that they'd both been named Jim, but were even more perplexed at the similarities that their lives took over the course of their lives. They learned that they'd both entered into law enforcement careers, one becoming a deputy sheriff while the other was a security guard. They also shared the same hobbies, as they both enjoyed woodworking and had a special love for mechanical drawing. But it got even weirder. When speaking about their love lives, they both found that they'd married a woman named Linda, but both of these marriages eventually failed. They both remarried later, quite inexplicably, each to a woman named Betty. They each had a son that was born around this same time, both named James, with the only difference being in their second names, as one was named Alan, with 2 L's, while the other was named Alan with 1 L. But the strange similarities only kept coming. They learned that each of their families had adopted a dog and named it Toy, an unusual name for a pet. They'd even visited the same beach with their families while on vacation, but had never been there at the same time as each other. Following the emotional reunion on television, the twins' story made national headlines, and they became the focus of a few intense studies undertaken by geneticists and psychologists who were researching the nature versus nurture theory. Their case also resulted in studies of other twins that had been separated shortly after birth in order to ascertain whether their case was a unique one, or whether the phenomenon was also present in some other similar cases. These studies found that separated twins often follow a very similar path in their lives, and they very often develop very similar personality traits, despite having never met each other before. They've been found to share the same hobbies, have the same tastes in romantic partners, and even have similar intelligence levels. It's an uncanny tale that's revealed much that we didn't know about our genetics before the two Jims found each other, and thanks to them, we now have a much firmer understanding of the role that it plays in our lives. Number 5. We tend to think that a series of uncanny coincidences that lead to a romantic relationship is something reserved for romantic comedy movies that are usually far too good to be true in real life. But there is one story that's been recounted by one of the parties involved, a man named Paul Gratchen, who'd been dating a woman who he was very much in love with. They had only been on a handful of dates, but he was so smitten with her that he was on the verge of asking her to be his girlfriend. In an article that Paul wrote, he stated that whenever he saw Esther, the woman he'd been dating, she made him laugh and he always felt elated. He had been planning to take her on a dinner date on the upcoming weekend, during which he would ask her if she wanted to start a serious relationship. Since they'd gotten together a few times, he knew that she was interested in him, but he still felt anxious at the prospect of asking such a big question. But he decided to put it out of his mind for the time being, since he was at work. Later that day, he left his workplace at lunchtime and walked into a deli where he bought a sandwich for lunch. He placed his order and reached into his wallet to pay when he noticed something strange on a dollar bill that he received as change earlier that same day. As he handed the money to the cashier, he realized that something was written on one of the bills and decided to take a closer look. To his utter surprise, he found that someone had written the name Esther on the bill in pencil, the same name as the woman he was dating. He decided to keep the dollar, and while he was on his way back to work, he came up with the idea to frame the bill and gift it to Esther that weekend when they met up for their dinner date. He was sure that she would find it as uncanny and surprising as he had, so he stopped in at a drugstore to buy a small photo frame. The weekend eventually passed by, and that Friday night, the couple met up at a restaurant for their date. Paul mustered up the nerve to ask Esther the question that had been on his mind, and to his delight, she agreed to start a relationship with him. Feeling relieved that the moment had passed successfully, he produced a wrapped box with the framed dollar bill inside. Esther was delighted to receive a gift and quickly unwrapped it, but to Paul's surprise, she seemed completely dumbstruck when she saw what was inside. He then told her how he found the bill in his wallet while at the deli, and that he thought it would be an amusing gift, but still he received no reply from Esther. For a few moments, he thought that he'd somehow offended her since she didn't have the reaction that he was expecting, but instead she seemed confused and shocked. She merely put the frame into her purse and told Paul to remind her to tell him something later. But for the next year, they never spoke about the gift, and eventually, Paul decided that he wanted to ask Esther to marry him, since the relationship had been going great. She immediately accepted his proposal, and eventually, the couple decided to move into an apartment together. While they were unpacking in their new place, Paul opened a box and found the framed dollar inside. He remarked how Esther had never finished their conversation about the bill, and this time she was only too happy to share her strange tale. She told Paul that she'd been working as a cashier at a coffee shop for a few years before they met, and at the same time, she was in a relationship that seemed to be going nowhere. This caused her to start thinking about how one would know when they met the love of their life, and she came up with an unusual idea. She wrote her name on $10 bills in her cash register and handed them out during the day, and she would make change for the store's customers. She then said a prayer that one of those bills would end up with the man that she would marry one day. And when Paul showed her the bill on their dinner date, she was certain that she'd found the right partner and that they would eventually get married. The couple went on to have 3 children, and the dollar bill is displayed on their dresser as a daily reminder of the fortunate hand that fate has dealt them. Number 4. The Wizard of Oz is one of the most famous movies ever made, as it captivates the imaginations of children and adults alike. And even 84 years after it was released, it remains as popular as ever. But the film isn't only famous for its great storytelling and acting performances, as it's given rise to many misremembered scenes, myths, and conspiracy theories over the years, many of which have been proven to be true. An example of this is that many people believe that the main character Dorothy wears a pink shirt in the film, while others maintain that it's white. The fact is that both are correct, since the actress Judy Garland was wearing a pink shirt during filming, but thanks to the Technicolor process, it showed up on screen as white. The film has also been included in Mandela effect theories, as most people remember the Wicked Witch calling out to her minions the words "Fly, fly, my pretties," while the reality is that she only called out "Fly, fly, fly." There are many other myths about the movie, many of which have been debunked, but there's one story that has been confirmed, although it seems almost too peculiar to be true. Planning for the film started the year before it was released, and while this process was ongoing, the production team was asked by director Victor Fleming to acquire an authentic Edwardian jacket that would be used as the wizard's coat. The team immediately started their search, but was surprised to find that these jackets were hard to come by, despite being all the rage back in the day. They searched through every costume shop they could find in Hollywood, but had no luck, and so they started searching in New York instead. Quite unbelievably, they had no luck here either, despite again searching through every costume shop they could find. Time was running out, but the team knew that failure wasn't an option, and as fate would have it, they stumbled across a thrift shop as they were headed back to the train station to return to the movie set. On a whim, they decided to try their luck and entered the store, and they were immediately greeted by the sight of an Edwardian jacket hanging at the back of the store. They bought it and raced back to Hollywood, where it was found to be a perfect fit for Frank Morgan, who played the role of the wizard. Filming was an arduous process, thanks to the high temperatures at the time, and Morgan found that the newly acquired coat was heavy and exceedingly warm, causing him to sweat while he was on set. This caused the coat's pockets to become moist, since he couldn't take it off in between takes, so he got into the habit of turning them inside out while he wasn't on camera so that they could dry out. On one occasion, he had done just that when one of the stagehands who were present noticed something strange about one of the coat's pockets. He walked over to Morgan to take a closer look, and to his surprise, found that it contained a name tag that had been sewn into the pocket. Other cast and crew members also noticed and gathered around Morgan to learn who the coat had belonged to before becoming part of the iconic movie. Morgan took hold of the name tag and showed it to everyone present, resulting in an almost spooky silence. The name on the inside of the pocket was that of L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz. The film's publicist, Mary Mayer, decided to contact the tailor where the coat had been made, and they confirmed that they had indeed made it for Baum years earlier. Baum's widow also confirmed that it had belonged to him, and once production wrapped up, it was presented to her as a gift. Strangely, she would recount the tale to friends afterward, but found that no one believed her, as they thought the whole tale was just a publicity stunt to create excitement over the film. Number 3. Émile Deschamps was a poet who was born in France and lived from 1791 to 1871. He's noted as being instrumental in the development of Romanticism in poetry, and is hailed as one of the founders of La Muse Française, a periodical that was published in 1823. He also created translations for both Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth. But before he became a noted poet, Deschamps became good friends with his family's next-door neighbor, Mr. M. de Forgebus. On one occasion, Forgebus had been on a trip to England and upon his return presented Deschamps with a gift, a portion of plum pudding that he'd brought back with him. He told the boy that plum pudding was a common dish in England, but that it was a rarity in France, and when Deschamps took his first bite, he was astonished at how delicious it was, and it quickly became his favorite dessert. The would-be poet eventually grew up and on one occasion walked past a French restaurant that had started displaying some of its more popular dishes in its front window to entice passing pedestrians to come inside. To his amazement and excitement, he noticed that one of the displays included a serving of plum pudding, and he immediately raced inside, since he'd only tasted it on that one occasion when Forgebus shared it with him. He asked one of the servers for a portion but was informed that the last serving had just been sold to another patron moments earlier. He asked who it had been sold to, and the server pointed to an elderly gentleman sitting a few tables away, and to his delight, he found that it was his old neighbor, Mr. Forgebus, who then happily shared his portion with him. This is already uncanny enough, but the strange series of events doesn't end there. Many years later, Deschamps was invited to a dinner party that was attended by only a handful of guests, who were informed that they were in for a treat, as the hosts would be serving an unusual dish during the night. It turned out to be a dessert, and to Deschamps' delight, he found that it was his favorite, plum pudding. It also gave him the perfect opportunity to recount his uncanny meeting with his neighbor, who had introduced him to the dish, and upon finishing the story, he mused that the only missing thing from the party at that point was Mr. Forgebus. The party went on, but unbeknownst to Deschamps, it still held one more surprise in store. Later that evening, someone knocked at the door, to the surprise of everyone present, since everyone who'd been invited was already there. When the door was opened, it revealed a very elderly man whom Deschamps immediately recognized as his old beloved neighbor. It would then come to light that Mr. Forgebus had also been invited to a dinner party that same evening, but had gotten the address wrong, and ended up knocking on the door where Deschamps was visiting. This prompted Deschamps to cry out, "3 times in my life I've eaten plum pudding, and 3 times have I seen M. de Forgebus. A 4th time I should feel capable of anything, or capable of nothing." It isn't known if the two men ever met again after that night, but one thing is certain, they had a remarkable tale to recount for the rest of their lives. Number 2. According to some sources, the chances of winning the Australian lottery are about 1 in 8.1 million. Despite these unlikely odds, lotteries are played by millions of people around the world every day, and now and then someone gets lucky and wins an absurd amount of money. Many people would say that winning the lottery is an uncanny event in itself, since it's very unlikely to happen. But one man from Australia has defied those odds, and he may just be the luckiest man Australia has ever seen. That man is Bill Morgan, a truck driver who'd not been having the best of luck in his life in June of 1998. At the time, he was very much in love with his girlfriend, but had been unable to muster up the courage to ask her to marry him. His life would take an unexpected turn a few months later while he was driving his truck, as he suffered a serious heart attack. Luckily, passers-by saw what had happened and came to his aid by calling an ambulance, and Bill was rushed to a nearby hospital. Here, he received treatment, and it seemed as though he would pull through, but the doctors who were treating him failed to check his medical history properly, leading to a disaster that could have easily been avoided. During his treatment, he was given certain medications that he was allergic to, leading to a serious reaction, and unfortunately, Bill passed away. Doctors refused to give up, and for the next 14 minutes they struggled to bring him back to life. They were ultimately successful, but warned his family that he could suffer from serious effects, since he was brought back after such a long time. In these instances, people often end up with severely impaired motor functions, and in some cases, irreparable brain damage, since circulation to the brain has stopped functioning for a long time. This might be the first instance of Bill winning the proverbial lottery, since he showed no ill effects after he regained consciousness, and was able to carry on with his life as normal, defying all the odds after being in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. His family would later recount that while Bill was on life support, doctors informed them that there was only a minimal chance that he would pull through, and that it would be best if they started preparing themselves for the worst. They were eventually asked whether they would like to take him off of life support, but they refused since they believed he would eventually wake up. When he eventually did wake up, he realized that he'd been given a new lifeline and set about making a few changes to his lifestyle. He finally proposed to his girlfriend and decided that he would start looking for a new job. He didn't mind working as a truck driver, but now felt that there was more to life. He also knew that it might take a while before he found something suitable, and so in the meantime, he tried his hand at the lottery. He went to a convenience store and bought a scratch ticket, and to his surprise, discovered that he'd won a brand new car, a Toyota Corolla that at the time was worth around $30,000. He couldn't believe his luck. Not only had he just survived an event that would surely have claimed his life, but just a short while later, he became the owner of a new vehicle that he desperately wanted. A Melbourne news outlet caught wind of Bill's amazing stroke of luck, and they decided to conduct an interview with him. Normally, a lottery ticket that resulted in winning a car wasn't anything newsworthy, but since Bill had just survived not only a heart attack, but also a serious allergic reaction that should have ended his life, they felt that it would make for an interesting story if nothing else. Bill agreed to the interview, and he met up with the news crew at the same store where he'd bought the winning scratch card. He then drove to the store in the car that he had won just days earlier. Upon his arrival, the crew informed him that they'd like him to reenact the entire event from the moment that he arrived in the store's parking lot. He obliged and did as they asked, walking through the doors up to the cash register and asking for another ticket, which he then paid for while the film crew was filming. He proceeded to scratch the newly purchased ticket, but was caught off guard by what happened next. He turned to the news crew with a look of disbelief on his face. He revealed that he had just won $250,000. In the footage, the camera is zoomed in all the way on the ticket, and Bill can be seen scratching the card before turning around and announcing, "I've just won $250,000, I'm not joking." He's visibly shaken while the news crew can be heard gasping in astonishment. Completely overwhelmed by another unbelievably fortunate event, he jokes that he may have another heart attack. He then phones his girlfriend while on camera to announce the good news, and judging by his reaction, she doesn't believe him at first, and in all honesty, who can blame her? Number 1. While in school, many of us likely found the subject of history to be boring, since textbooks are filled with endless dates and names that we're expected to remember, and once we're done with the subject, these facts are usually quickly forgotten. It would be a much more interesting subject if we were taught about the strange coincidences that occurred throughout history, though this wouldn't do much for the careers of aspiring historians. One such strange occurrence took place on the 28th of July, 1900, when the King of Italy at the time, Umberto I, was visiting the city of Monza, and while there, he decided to have a meal in one of the local restaurants. It seemed a normal restaurant like any other in the region, but while he and one of his associates were in the middle of his meal, the owner of the restaurant walked over to their table as he was in the habit of talking to his guests. The two men were astonished to find that they looked remarkably alike, to the point where they wondered if they were doppelgangers. This intrigued them both, and they decided to sit down and talk to each other for a while. As the conversation progressed, though, they would come to find that their physical appearance was just one of many things in their lives that were impossibly similar. The first and most obvious thing, other than their looks, was that they had the same name, Umberto. Not only this, they also discovered that they were both born in Turin, which in itself is remarkable, but they were also born on the exact same day. The two men marveled at the synchronicity of their lives, but could not have been prepared for the rest of their conversation, as they would find out that there were even more strange coincidences that they could hardly wrap their heads around. Not only had they both been born on the same day, in the same city, and been given the same name, but they both grew up to have their marriages on the same date as well. Another strange coincidence that seemed too outlandish to be believed, and it didn't end there. They then realized that not only had they gotten married on the same day, but they'd both married a woman named Margherita, and both had sons who they named Vittorio. Umberto, the restaurant owner, then realized that there was yet another connection. He had opened his restaurant's doors for the very first time on the day that Umberto the king had been coronated. The two men could hardly believe the strange connections between them, and the king found it profoundly moving. He decided that he wanted to get to know his namesake a little better, and hence invited him to join him at an athletics competition the very next day, an invitation that the restaurant owner was all too happy to accept. But fate would have one more hand to play in this strange tale. Before the restaurant owner could attend the meet, he met his unfortunate end at the hands of a man who was wielding a firearm, a crime that was described as having been committed under unexplained circumstances. It was an unfortunate event that meant King Umberto would never get to know his new friend, and upon hearing the news of the other Umberto's untimely death, he was said to be distraught. Unfortunately, he would never get the chance to mourn his friend, or find out who the culprit was who had ended his life. Unbeknownst to the king, he was being stalked by an American-Italian man named Gaetano Brescio, who felt that he had a score to settle. Brescio was an anarchist who was up in arms over the fact that the Italian military had used live weapons against a group of protesters in May of 1898, an event that many Italians felt was excessive and unnecessarily heavy-handed for a protest over something as small as the price of bread at the time. Brescio was especially upset over the fact that the king had awarded one of his generals the Medal of Senior Office after the fact, as he felt that he'd handled the situation perfectly and had restored order to the city. He proceeded to follow the king and ended his life in the same fashion that the restaurant owner had perished, with the use of a firearm. Many people have speculated that the two Umbertos were possibly related somehow, with some suggesting that they may have been twins that were separated at birth, though there's really no evidence to prove this theory. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.